Poverty is changing. Extreme poverty in most countries is falling. A better future for millions. A reason for hope. But for people living in the shadow of instability and conflict, it's a different picture. Often in countries with weak governments and institutions, facing a volatile and insecure environment, they are also challenged by rising poverty. Just 10% of the global population live in these fragile settings. But by 2030, up to 2/3 of the people in extreme poverty will be living in these areas. Poverty is changing, so the World Bank is changing too. We cannot end poverty without supporting peace. Addressing conflict and fragility is essential in the fight against extreme poverty.
Hello, everybody, and welcome to the launch of the new book, Fragility and Conflict on the Front Lines of the Fight Against Poverty. My name is Karolina Sanchez, and I am the Global Director for Poverty and Equity at the World Bank. It's a real pleasure to welcome all of you to today's event, and I'm very much looking forward to both the presentation and the discussion that will follow. We had originally planned to launch this report during the 2020 Fragility Forum organized by the World Bank. The forum is an opportunity to bring practitioners and technical experts together to talk about issues related to fragile and conflict environments. But unfortunately, because of the COVID-19 outbreak, the forum had to be postponed indefinitely. But it's a pleasure to share with you that instead, what we are considering is to put together a whole series of virtual events that will bring those experts that we were planning to invite to the forum so that we can actually have those conversations over the next few weeks and months. And this event today is the first one of that virtual series. So it's really exciting for us to kick off that engagement with all of you. I wanted to start by maybe sharing some thoughts as to what the rationale was, the motivation for undertaking this work and for this report. And really, there are two main reasons for this. The first one is that as we look over the last 25 years or 3 decades, what we see is that we live in a two-speed world where most of the developing regions are making significant progress in the elimination of extreme poverty. But at the same time, we see very little progress or stagnation in sub-Saharan Africa and in fragile and conflict environments. And what that means is that currently we see both poverty rates being much higher and the number of poor being much higher in African countries and in fragile and conflict affected countries. And that will only exacerbate moving forward. The second observation is that in fragile and conflict environments, we have many people who are invisible to us, both in terms of the population overall, but more importantly, in terms of the poor people and the vulnerable people that actually live in these conditions. And if they are invisible and we don't know what are the constraints and the problems that they face on a daily basis, it is extremely hard for all of us to design effective policies that can help them overcome those constraints and lift themselves out of poverty. So it was really that background and that dual realization, if you want, that motivated the team to spend some time trying to understand the relationship between fragility and conflict on the one hand and poverty and broader well-being on the other. And what you will hear today during the presentation are some of the findings of this work, which I'm sure you will find interesting and exciting. And then we'll be able to delve into some of those issues in more depth with our panelists. So without further ado, I would like to pass the floor to Tara Vishwana. Tara is a lead economist at the World Bank in the Poverty and Equity Group, and she's one of the main authors of the report. She'll walk us through some of the main findings for the next 15 to 20 minutes, and then we'll move on to the panel. Welcome again. And as I said, looking forward to the discussion. Thank you. Tara, over to you. Tara, you're muted.
Okay, sorry. Good afternoon. Thank you for joining us for this lockdown version of a launch of this report. which has been in public domain for the past couple months. As Carol mentioned, we are presenting these insights in the context of a global pandemic. And so we are going to see that these are only going to amplify the grave welfare challenges already faced by people living in fragility, conflict, and violence. So the broader implications we draw from this report are going to be important and urgent, particularly to understand the manifestations of FCS countries and also to tailor the response to the pandemic to protect the poor and the vulnerable. Can you go to the first slide, Brad? The next one. Yes. So let's start with some background and context for this report. So what you can see on the left side of the graph, the left-hand graph, is that countries have made tremendous progress in reducing extreme poverty. And as it portrays that we had 700 million people who lived on less than $1.90 a day, compared to almost twice that number a decade ago. But at the same time, in the right-hand side of the graph, what you see is that there has been a large increase in exposure to conflict, and the number of people living within 60 kilometers of a major conflict has also doubled to 220 million over the same period. So essentially, as Carol said, we are living in a two-speed world, and our failure to reduce fragility and conflict threatens to halt the progress in eliminating extreme poverty. So today, in the midst of the pandemic, I have to tell you that early simulations suggest that this trend of a global decline is probably going to reverse for the first time since 1998, pushing close to 50 million people into poverty. Next slide. So as we approach this report, what we found is that there are significant data gaps that limit our ability to monitor welfare in fragile contexts. And these are places where timely and relevant data seldom exist. So we estimate, for instance, that globally, 500 million people, or 7 out of 10 people living in FCS are not well represented in global estimates of poverty, either because there are no internationally comparable estimates, or that these countries have entered or escaped or remained in conflict. For example, Syria and Mali, these are countries where our latest estimates predate the conflict, right? So the economies have gone through significant changes there, and we don't have the latest numbers. So we also don't have estimates of forcibly displaced populations, and these are rarely, if ever, counted in household surveys. And we are only now going to begin to address this. Next slide. So to address these data gaps, in the report, we resort to analytic techniques to estimate poverty here in these economies, and we provide a more accurate picture of welfare in these countries. Using these revised estimates, what we find is that half of the global poor live in FCS context today, and by 2030, 10% of the world's populations that are living in fragile and conflict economies will account for 2/3 of the global poor. Next slide. And hence, the title of the slide of this slide, right? We argue that the war on poverty can only be won by addressing fragility, conflict, and violence, particularly in sub-Saharan Africa. Today, the 43 poorest economies in the world are all in FCS or in sub-Saharan Africa, or overlap significantly. Next slide. Now, these patterns of extreme poverty being increasingly concentrated in fragile countries is being driven by countries that have been chronically in the state of FCS. For instance, what we do, we take the latest criteria that the World Bank uses to classify countries of as FCS, and we take them back through to 2000 and look for countries that have stayed in that state continuously. So these are the chronically fragile countries, and while they accounted for only 5% of the world's poor in 2000, they are projected to account for 1/4 of the world's poor by 2030. Next slide. So this is the state of extreme poverty, right? Let's move on from extreme poverty to the non-monetary dimensions of welfare. What you see in this graph is FCS economies are, of course, characterized by much higher rates of extreme poverty, but they're also significantly deprived in non-monetary dimensions, right? These include access to education, access to infrastructure services like drinking water, sanitation, electricity, and so on, right? So they are 2.5 times more likely to be deprived in this multidimensional sense. And we all know that such deprivations limit the ability for people to accumulate human capital, escape poverty, and they contribute significantly to poverty traps. Next slide. Now, furthermore, human capital formation, as we all know, may know already, is being directly harmed by conflict. A growing body of work, we document in the report that a growing body of country-specific work documents the long-term and intergenerational consequences of exposure to conflict. For example, conflict harms the health of women and future generation educational attainments of children yet to be born in utero, as well as school-going children. Thus, exposure to conflict adversely affects human capital accumulation across generations, and these are irreversible and limit the economic potential of these economies as a whole. Next slide. Now, when you go from country studies, you see these translate in global data, right? These harmful effects of being in an FCS country on children are also reflected in all the indicators that we use to construct the human capital index, where you can see in this graph that economies facing high intensity conflict fare far worse than other economies in FCS, and which in turn fare far worse than economies not classified as FCS. And as we all know, deprivations in some of these early childhood achievements have lifelong and intergenerational implications. Next slide. And let's now look at intergenerational educational mobility. The graph on the left portrays that living in fragility and conflict, it's measured in terms of average conflict deaths that you face in primary school going age. It limits your chance of having better education than your parents. And the graph on the right shows that your educational outcomes are more closely driven by your parents, the intergenerational persistence aspect, and your chances of doing better than your parents is also much lower. Remember that education is strongly related to the prospects in the labor market, so this story is very true for intergenerational economic mobility as well. Next slide. Here are two country cases. On the left-hand side, you see Iraq, right, where cohorts born before 1968 were likely to gain much more education than their parents. In contrast, cohorts born after 1970 were exposed to the Iran-Iraq war or the Gulf War, and their odds of doing better significantly fell, right? Especially for the younger cohorts. Now in Vietnam, what you see is a similar pattern where older cohorts born before 1970, the education attainment falls relative to their parents, whereas after the US war ended, the cohorts do a lot better. Next slide. So far, what we've seen is that the negative impacts of being an FCS in an FCS country are multidimensional, and they affect generations. So to mitigate these negative impacts, we need to act early, appropriately. But how do we do that? How do we act early when we don't know what characterizes the fragility of countries? Because not all FCS countries are the same. They are driven by different elements of fragility risks, right? So we need to find an analytic approach to concretely define this heterogeneity among them. Now, for this, we can take the help of these new data-driven approaches. Every day, we are being prompted, right? In our Google search attempts, Amazon tries to nudge us on what to buy, and even increasingly in economics, we're using this to understand economic decision making, right? So we use such clustering approaches to try and group countries that are similar into different groups. Next slide. So in the report, we use many indicators as are listed under the graph in the slide. And these are known to be important correlates of fragility. And we come up with the clustering of one typology of countries, right? We use data for 190 countries along these dimensions of governance, political stability, and other economic aspects. They range, if you can see, we plot the global mean, the standard deviation of the global mean of these indicators. And what we see is the benchmark of the first group that are these very good performing, strong governance, transparency, high income OECD countries. And on the other end of the spectrum is group 6, which are countries in active conflict and perform the worst in governance indicators. These are Iraq, Syria, Libya, Afghanistan. Next slide, please. Now, the interesting part is look at group 2 through group 5. They have distinct markers that are different and higher than others. For instance, group 2 is characterized by elevated homicide rates. Venezuela falls in this category. Group 4 by a significantly higher share of refugees compared to other groups due to neighborhood conflict spillovers, Lebanon and Jordan. Group 5 are countries with a combination of high resource rents, weak governance, high potential for ethnic fractionalization. Chad comes here. Group 3 is an interesting one that is scattered with some markers of fragility, but nothing clearly distinguishing them. So for example, countries like Nigeria, Ukraine, Cameroon, they fall among the 20 countries with highest rates of conflict-related deaths, but they perform slightly better around the markers. So they bear watching because some of these markers could shift countries mapping from group 3 to other higher fragile groups. So more needs to be done on data collection, on getting country-specific data, because most conflicts are now subnational, not interstate. But these methods provide a start for some directions for informing monetary and policy response. So now moving on to the last slide, I want to conclude on a forward-looking note. Let's summarize a few lessons that emerge with the recognition that without addressing the challenges of FCS, we will not be able to end poverty. There is a lot we can do, and we can do them much better. So firstly, we need the right data at the right time, sufficiently disaggregated at the country and subnational levels to be able to act early and monitor evolving risk. Lots of innovation happening on how to use technology to collect data, measure, monitor, which will help us identify these risks with appropriate policy levers. We need to develop systems of learning to scale up what works and to adapt to uncertain environments that such contexts present. Package of interventions, as we saw, we have multidimensional deprivations. We should use country-specific diagnostic to coordinate efforts to address them, using delivery mechanisms commensurate with capacity. For example, a package of interventions for Afghanistan would not be the same as Nigeria or Somalia. And vulnerable groups, especially women and children, displaced populations, need to be targeted to avert the negative consequences they are likely to suffer for a lifetime. Finally, COVID-19 has hit all countries, but pre-existing conditions in FCS, weak institutions, health and infrastructure systems can significantly undermine their ability to deal with the crisis and can exacerbate the risks of political and social instability. So urgent support is needed beyond humanitarian assistance. They include debt relief, but they also need impactful interventions that build resilience in these vulnerable communities and countries for the long haul. With that, I thank you very much. Over to you, Carol.
Thank you, Tara, very much for sharing the highlights of the report, which, as I said earlier, are very interesting, although at the same time quite sobering for those of us that work and worry about the situation in these fragile and conflict environments. So I'm gonna now turn to our distinguished panel. So what I'll do is I'll introduce the panelists at the beginning, and then we'll go into some questions that we've prepared to kick off the discussion with them. And in the meantime, I encourage all of you to start submitting any questions that you may have on either the presentation or what you hear from our panelists through the chat boxes that you have available, and we'll turn to those as the discussion moves forward. So let me start with the introductions. I'll go in alphabetical order. So it's a pleasure to be joined by Asad Alam. Asad is the Regional Director for the Eastern and Southern Africa Department, and he represents the Equitable Growth, Finance, and Institutions group at the bank. In this position, he's responsible for a lot of things, but let me try to summarize the main, and that's the design, development, and delivery of country-focused programs on the areas that I mentioned. So that's sort of growth, institutions, poverty, and equity. In the past, Asad has held numerous positions at the World Bank, so I'll just mention a few. He was, before joining his current post, he was the Chief of Staff for the President of the World Bank Group, and he was also country director prior to that for Egypt, Yemen, and Djibouti. So he obviously has a lot of experience, including firsthand experience working in fragile and conflict environments. Welcome, Asad. We also have joining us Tarek Ghani, who's the chief economist and future, for the International Crisis Group. He's also an assistant professor at the Washington University's All-in Business School, although he's on leave from there at the moment, and a non-resident fellow of the Global Economy and Development Program at the Brookings Institution. Between 2006 and 2009, Tarek oversaw conflict prevention grants at the private foundation Humanity United. And he has also worked with the Center for Global Development, the Center for Strategic and International Studies, the United States Institute for Peace, and the World Bank. So again, another one of our speakers and panelists that has extensive experience on these issues. And then finally, we have with us Abby Maxman, who is the president and CEO for Oxfam America since 2017. She has more than 30 years of experience working in international humanitarian relief and development, and in that capacity has been focusing on issues related to policies and systems that may perpetuate extreme poverty around the world. Prior to joining Oxfam, Abby served as a Deputy Secretary General for CARE International in Geneva, where she provided leadership across the CARE Confederation. And she has previously served, among other responsibilities, as Vice President for International Programs and Operations for CARE USA, and in other country and regional leadership roles in Africa, Latin America, Asia, and the Middle East. Welcome, Abby. You may have seen in the program announcement that we would also expecting to be joined by Donald Kaberuka, who was a previous president of the African Development Bank. Unfortunately, he has not been able to join, so we'll have a panel of 3 instead of panel of 4, as we had originally envisioned. But I'm confident that that won't have any bearing on the quality of the discussion, given what I just told you about the speakers. So Asad, I'm gonna come to you first and maybe ask you to reflect a little bit on the strategies that we should think about to combat poverty in Africa, which is a region that you're very familiar with. And I'm asking about this because of the overlap that we see between African countries and fragility, with many of those countries actually being in situations that are fragile or actually suffering from domestic conflicts. So if you can tell us a little bit, how should we be thinking about these challenges, particularly related to poverty and living standards in the African and particularly the fragile context? Thank you.
Thanks, Carol, and it's great to be part of this panel to discuss this very interesting report. With respect to your question, addressing the acute poverty, inequality, fragility issues in FCV countries, one has to address it in so many different ways, and really have a multi-pronged approach. We all know that in order to get growth going, get incomes growing, you need to help create jobs, so have a strategy that is very inclusive to pull up people and get meaningful employment for people, and also address the acute deprivations that might be there through social protection programs and various other support programs to support households and entrepreneurs. But I think the challenge of the FCV countries is quite unique. And I would like to really focus on 2 particular challenges and approaches that I think very important to underpin any approach to address the issues of poverty and inequality. One is to really focus on institutions. Because, in many of these countries, one of the core reasons why there is fragility is because institutions have collapsed, institutions don't exist, and these may be government institutions, private institutions, societal institutions. So when I used to work on Cover Yemen, one of the things that we were trying to do is to really try to invest in core institutions at the community level. For instance, the Social Fund for Development that used to work with communities to provide income support programs. So having institutions of those sort are very important for resilience, so that services can continue to be delivered even in the face of conflict. For another key institution that I would like to mention, and I think this is important and relevant because the report also talks about it, is institutions of gathering data. Because data is very scarce, and it is very difficult to have the same type of robust data systems that we may want to have in other countries. And investing in innovative ways of using digital technologies, spatial geographic satellite imagery, for instance, to collect data in real time so that we can actually have approaches that address the needs. So investing in institutions, but also investing in children. I think investing in the assets, and I think Tara mentioned in her remarks about the importance of trying to prevent intergenerational deprivation and poverty. And I think investing in children, everything from immunization programs, making sure that kids are immunized against polio. And this is what we did in Yemen, 5 million children, door-to-door campaign, for people actually going in mountains, in villages, house to house, making sure that the children are getting immunized. I think things of that sort are very important, but also investing in education and thinking of ways that education can be provided, even in conflict. And I think the current pandemic with the global shutdown, 180 countries with schools, children not going to school, that actually makes it even more important and poignant that even in an FCV context, we need to have schools that can operate and maybe using innovative ways of online learning or tablets that can actually provide some pedagogical material and support, maybe community-based learning. So I think we have to experiment with various approaches on how do you actually strengthen institutions and investing in children if we need to have any prospect for hope for the future. Thanks.
Thanks, Asad. We'll come back to some of those topics, I suspect, as we move forward in the discussion. Tarek, maybe let me turn to you and touch upon an issue that Tara highlighted in her presentation, and I think Asad just alluded to, and that's the issue of data. And I think one of the main points that the report makes is that we are almost driving blind in situations where we would need to have the most possible data to be effective. So drawing from your experience, what are some of your thoughts in terms of how we can incorporate hard data, but also maybe sort of somewhat unusual or newer data like big data and other types of data into our thinking to build a stronger evidence base to tackle issues related to conflict and fragility and how they impact poverty and the well-being of households and individuals?
Thank you, Karolina, and congratulations to Tara and all the co-authors for a truly important report. And thank you for the opportunity to be able to discuss this today. I think it's worth reflecting for a moment before turning to the data question how far the World Bank itself and other international institutions have come in just 15 years on this topic. So when I worked at the bank in 2004 in what was then called the LICUS unit, the Low Income Countries Under Stress Initiative, which then evolved into FCB over time, I think it was unclear that we were in such a stark position. It was also unclear whether the bank was going to be able to evolve to address these questions, in part because of the lack of certain language to be able to grapple with governance and institutions in a way in which sort of member states felt comfortable, but also in part because these are truly challenging environments, both from an operational point of view, but also from a policy point of view. In essence, the risk that's embedded in any grant or loan is going to be far more complex and nuanced in a FCS setting than it's going to be in a traditional environment. And thus I commend the bank for its efforts to evolve into grappling with those risks in real time. So coming to the data question, this is something I've devoted most of the past decade to thinking about, and I've had a bit of an evolution in where I've landed on the issue over time. I absolutely think there are opportunities for creative data sources to be used to supplement, to extend, and to complement the existing data sources that might be produced in central statistics offices in these settings. I think it's worth noting that sometimes the central statistics office has completely broken down. And we know that there are challenges to getting those back up and running. And I think that's sort of a longer term investment. But what we have seen is the emergence of, creative big data approaches. Some of that is satellite driven. Some of that is other large scale passive digital data, trace like cell phone data that can be used. And some of it now, I think, is also coming to an evolution where we're recognizing the limitations of those data sets. Part of that is the ability to validate any of those data depends on a complementary and traditional source of data to sort of speak to it, but also to ground truth. Sometimes we're coming back to more qualitative methods, coming back to more traditional field work and engaging with local populations, which is something that the International Crisis Group has always been particularly skilled at. So I think finding the interface between what big data can tell us in terms of broad patterns, but then what smaller, more localized engagement, some of which can be quantitative, some of which can be qualitative, can do, really extends our knowledge, not just the amount of data that's available to us. And happy to talk about some of those examples in the Q&A afterwards.
Thank you very much. And we actually indeed already have a few questions coming in that are asking for more practical recommendations about what practitioners and governments can do in this space. So we'll come back to that. Abby, let me turn to you and ask you to reflect on something that I know you deeply care about and you often raise in the context of discussions on fragility and conflict, and that's the role of politics and political economy as important drivers of what we see on the ground. So I wanted you to reflect a little bit on that, but then also maybe ask you if you have any sort of practical recommendations for how institutions like the World Bank, who by mandate are apolitical, should incorporate this kind of thinking into our analysis, because sometimes it can be a challenge. So again, you're thinking, but then more concretely, what would you suggest that we do, for example? Thank you.
Thank you, Karolina. And really, it's I want to celebrate and appreciate the report. It is providing a rich and data-driven way to really recognize who's being left behind, and it makes an absolutely fundamental contribution to current thinking on fragility and conflict. And when the World Bank steps in, that's significant. So the recognition that this piece of work gives and to enabling us to address these big issues and big gaps of our time is absolutely key. I would challenge the framing of the question about whether the bank can be apolitical, given its size, given its influence. While it would strive to be, there are questions, especially, as you said, around politics and the political economy that is recognized it's not central to the analysis. And so the report reveals a challenge that's facing the World Bank as it enters its new strategy of how it can manage the inevitable unintended harms that result from investing in FCVs, where power holders may be the bad actors, and as Tarek said earlier, or Assad, where institutions are weak. So those are things that need to be considered. And I think we could ask that and call on the bank to consider three key things that Tara mentioned this earlier, that actually the political root causes and drivers are fundamental. One does need to factor those into their thinking. And by nature of the relationship of the bank with governments, its clients, one has to be thinking about the role it has in empowering those power holders who may not be able to address some of the social good, and it might inadvertently disempower those institutions that may be weak. So the bank needs to know, strengthen, and help to legitimize those parts of government that do provide the key social services to the most vulnerable, and not empower the parts of government that foster conflict and capture resources, perhaps illegitimately. And last, I think it's fundamental to ensure that governments are investing in the people, are accountable for upholding international standards and norms, and addressing human rights. And these need to be prominent in the bank's actions and commitments. Thanks.
Thanks, Abby. And I'm sure you've had an opportunity to look at the strategy, and I believe some of these issues certainly are discussed and acknowledged there, and we'll take the advice seriously, and we'll continue to explore how we can do a better job on that. Let me maybe with and I'm going to start weaving some of the questions that we've got from the audience so that we reflect what we're hearing from them. So maybe, Tarek, if I can come back to you to touch upon something that Tara said at the beginning, and I also said in passing, and that's the fact that, we live in a particularly challenging moment, right? I mean, we are talking about fragility and conflict, taking a more medium-term perspective, but of course, we are at a time when the world is suffering from massive, very important implications across countries in the whole sort of income spectrum, right? High income, middle income, low income. And of course, we expect that this is going to have important effects in fragile and conflict affected environments. So maybe ask you, because I'm sure this is something that you've been thinking about the impact that COVID-19 itself may have on the discussion that we are having today on, fragility and conflict on the one side, and the poverty impacts of that.
Absolutely. I think it's an incredibly important conversation to be having right now. So we see, of course, COVID-19, as the IMF was noting just 2 weeks ago, pushing us into a global economic recession, a number of countries facing massive belt tightening. The poverty alleviation implications of that, I think, are clear to all of us. What's a little bit less clear, and what Crisis Group has been spending a lot of time thinking about and now writing about, and you can find this in pieces that have come out in the last 6 weeks and that'll continue to come out, is how is this going to interact with some of the key conflict drivers that we worry about in fragile and conflict affected settings. The sort of conceptual framework that you can bring to this is thinking, of course, that there are going to be linkages between the economics of this and the politics of this. I think if you've been paying attention to what's happening in Lebanon right now, you can see a very clear example in which the shutdown in response to COVID-19, but also the very fragile economic situation that state found itself in before COVID-19 ever came along, now leading to increasing instability in a number of settings across that country. And I worry that we may see that in more settings to come, and that food insecurity in particular could be a very, very important driver of that we need to pay attention to in the conversation around export restrictions and a broader set of questions around supply chains, both within and between countries right now. I think as you look at the broader conflict prevention landscape, there are a variety of ways in which actors are interacting with COVID-19. There's the conflict prevention institutions like the United Nations and others who find themselves in a difficult position when you can't send mediators, when you can't rotate peacekeepers, when you find your staff are confined to compound. That's going to reduce your ability to operate in very fragile settings, and that's going to lead to an increase in short-term risks. It's also the case that both interstate and intrastate politics that already had some fragility to it can be exacerbated in this context, particularly if certain leaders see that to their advantage. But there are some hopeful signs, particularly with UN Secretary General's call for a global ceasefire. And in a number of settings, I think conflict actors are beginning to look at that seriously. Yemen is one where we still hold out hope that there might be additional efforts that can come to bear over time, where everyone recognizes that the COVID-19 is also an opportunity for actors to renegotiate the politics of their settings, and that could provide a basis, if seized and reinforced by the international community, to begin to get us out of these poverty traps as well.
Thank you. Asad, I'm going to turn to you and ask you to reflect a little bit on your experience as a country director for Yemen, a country that it's living through a difficult situation. And I want to sort of ask you a question that I think is going to pick up on some of what I'm hearing from the audience, because we have many of our listeners sort of asking about countries that are very fragile but not in conflict. How do we build resilience in that context? You alluded earlier to the role of institutions. How should we be thinking about institution building, again, in a fragile environment? So I wanted to sort of ask you to reflect on your own personal experience and maybe tell us a little bit about, how should the bank and others think about, how to build resilience, particularly in fragile environments, and what's the role of institutions in that, which I know is something that you deeply care about.
So thanks, Carol. No, I think that's a very interesting question, a very challenging question also. So Yemen, of course, we can talk about Yemen, but also maybe about some of the countries in sub-Saharan Africa, FCB countries that I was earlier this year. I was also in Sudan, which is also trying to grapple with how to rebuild society, after in the current context. So there are several ways actually that we can help, and one, and I alluded to earlier, I think the role of institutions, and institutions obviously cover a gamut of different institutions. One of the key things in an FCB countries is to make sure that basic institutions of government work, that salaries are getting paid, that that there is an effective some sort of a cash management system is in place, that there is an exchange rate that is reasonably market determined, that it is not distorted, or it is not that the transactions that take place at the border are not captured by elites or different interest groups. So making sure that basic systems of government, of law enforcement, of the rule of law. Now this is the challenge, right? In some ways, that is why countries are in an FCB status, because these systems of government are not working. But I think it is very important to actually strengthen some of these core institutions of government, because without that, it's very difficult to promote the type of work or development that one would like to see. Core to that also is transparency of the budget, transparency of the borrowings that the government might be doing, of transparency in the delivery of public services, who benefits from what. So I think strengthening these institutions of transparency, promoting accountability, all part of that setup is very important. The second big thing is really working at the local level with communities. So communities in many countries, they are the sources of resilience, right? And even in the middle of conflict, communities come together and they work. And I think we can do a better job in the international community of how we can actually empower these communities, make communities, and for instance, the delivery of services, the identification of beneficiaries for cash transfer programs, the reporting. I mean, in the current context, communities can also even play an important role, for instance, on COVID tracing, for instance, and helping communities change behaviors at the local level, at the household level, for nutrition support programs and things of that sort. So working with communities and having and supporting institutions at that level can be another important part of it. Cash transfer programs can be a very important part of promoting resilience, of giving people, direct cash, getting rid of beneficiaries, maybe using digital platforms, ID systems, if where possible. But sometimes, a crisis, even in low capacity countries, one can actually think of mobile payments, for instance, and see whether cell-based transfer systems can actually be used to transfer monies to people, and giving people the choice. So if they have the money, they can choose whether to buy food, pharmaceuticals, invest in their girls' education, or whatever. So I think investing in using technology in order to support the delivery of key services becomes an important part of how we can actually strengthen resilience and address the core challenges in these countries.
Thank you. Abby, I'm going to come to you, and in a way, go a little bit deeper into some of the things that you said earlier, but again, also bring some of the comments from the audience. So we've got quite a few questions that say, along the lines of, can we actually prevent conflict? How do we prevent fragility and conflict? How do we attack some of the root causes? How should we be thinking about prevention more broadly in this context? So I wanted you to maybe reflect a little bit about the balance between sort of the exposed, if you want, humanitarian and development response or prevention, and how do we think about that balance? Do you have examples of, when we've actually got this right, or, some ideas about how to think about it? And maybe in your answer, and here I'm again picking up from what the audience was asking, if you can reflect about the role that maybe coordination across different institutions can play. Of course, the World Bank at the UN, but others. Over to you.
Great, thanks. Great questions. And I can't help but overlay them through the lens of where we are right now in the COVID-19 reality. And I don't want to just call it a response, because it's also still ongoing preparedness, prevention, curbing, all the elements that we're all working with. And this is where we know the global humanitarian system has long been overstretched and one would argue underfunded, and cannot continuously meet the growing demands of emergency response, disaster risk reduction, preparedness, and that's where the nexus comes in and is so fundamental. We've known for decades that it is more economical, and I both financially and in terms of lives saved, in investing in preparedness, prevention. And we know that in the time of COVID, that all we can do the more we can do to step up, to reach out to communities where it has not hit now, will save lives and be the most cost-effective way of achieving the outcomes we all want and need to curb the impact of the crisis. And we know also a lot of lessons that we continue to have repeated is the best way to do this is for all international actors, all actors in general, to do two main things. And one is to increase funding for local and national humanitarian actors for action and transfer the decision-making power closer to the front lines. We are all humanitarians. This moment is putting us all in that light, that we know who are the first responders, who are the ones taking care of families, how do we make sure that the responses are timely and at the front lines of where they are, where they need to be. And that's happening today in the context of COVID. Now, this approach is central to Oxfam's COVID response and our work more generally, and we're continuing our work scaling up in 50 countries to deliver much needed assistance and curb the virus. And as Assad was mentioning, we're also scaling up our cash transfer programming and food assistance in vulnerable communities around the world, from poor urban settlements in Bangladesh to rural indigenous communities in Guatemala. And that suite of approaches and looking at the investment, getting resources out to protect for social protection and enabling prevention is absolutely critical at this time. And as the bank works more proactively in fragile and conflict settings, we look forward to continuing to collaborate and coordinate more. That's fundamental, the emphasis on coordination. And last, I know that there have been efforts ongoing, but we know that we need to maximize flexible, sustainable resources to countries. And that's through grants and also concessional financing from donors, as well as debt relief. And we need all creditors, including the World Bank, to step up and cancel debt payments owed to them by countries that are strapped for resources right now. And that's the quickest way that resources can be kept in countries to go to the social protection, the social services that are absolutely fundamental. Thank you.
Thank you, Abby. Tara, I'm actually going to come to you because there are a few questions that are coming that I think are sort of very much directed to the findings of the report, and I know these are issues that I thought about. So I'm gonna sort of share a couple of those with you. First question says, the report focuses a lot between the relationship between fragility and conflict on the one hand, and those being the cause of poverty. but you didn't say anything about the reverse relationship, right? Whether poverty actually has an impact on fragility and conflict. So there was a question as to whether we could say something on that. And then a related question, one of our members of the audience is picking up on the fact that you pointed out that actually many of the conflict and the fragility that we observe today is actually subnational, not necessarily sort of conflicts between nations. And if you could elaborate a little bit on the constraints that we face in deepening our understanding of these subnational sources of fragility and conflict. And again, I know this is something that you talk about in the report, but didn't make it to the presentation. So again, the circular relationship between fragility and conflict on one hand and poverty on the other, and then constraints to better understanding subnational conflict and fragility. Over to you, Tara.
Hello, thank you for these questions. And I wanted to start with a couple of things, right? When you do global, you do work at the global level, you are very constrained by your ability to get into causality, right? Why? Because fragility is a very multidimensional phenomenon, right? Some countries are fragile in an institutional sense, some exhibit social fragility, some others. So there are many, many drivers. And so at a country level, I think these questions become far more salient. But nevertheless, in the literature, there's a lot of work, particularly at the country level, less so globally, where you can demonstrate that the causality from poverty to conflict, particularly, not necessarily only fragility, but poverty to conflict, has been defying evidence, right? So a lot of places where poverty is not necessarily driving fragility by itself, and that comes from the fact, even in political science, right? So who can make the most noise? The poor have little voice, less ability to reach, the kinds of, or the luxury of income to be able to, engage in these collective, actions like riots and things. So there are many, many country-specific examples where you kind of don't see that. It's very weak from poverty to fragility. But you can also imagine other instances where it boils down to understanding the mechanism that links fragility and conflict, fragile environments to conflict, right? So for instance, there are many countries in sub-Saharan Africa where you've kind of been able to create establish a link between climate, for instance, right? Weather risks and climate to losses of income, right? A lot of herders and farmers who rely on income from farming or agriculture, and they lose income, and that income loss often triggers a local conflict, right? So there's a lot of, at the end of the day, what is very important is to understand the mechanism through which you can exacerbate that risk of conflict. In Liberia, a very similar study has been done that shows economic situations as mechanisms that are driving conflict. So it's not just the state of poverty, but it's this loss of income and other things that could actually lead you to that, and that comes from things like climate risk and so on. So I think we elaborate that a bit in the report. The second question, which talks about the intra-state conflict. So since the Second World War, I think what we've seen is a lot more conflict being driven by intrastate issues, right? And less by country-to-country wars. So this has been an incredibly interesting empirical observation, right? And these subnational things are not wars, but are conflicts that are driven much more locally, but can spread depending on how institutions and countries handle this, right? So I think this is why also in the report we kind of stress that our data agenda, right, our understanding, our monitoring agenda has to go granular. It has to go within countries. You have to understand with much more granularity what's happening within countries in terms of different levels of deprivation. So I think I will stop here unless there is something I missed in the question itself.
Thank you, Tara. That was very helpful. I'm going to come back to Tarek and then potentially Assad after that with the same question. And that's a question that Dominique and others have asked. And it's about the role of the private sector in helping us in a way overcome, in this case, fragility. So maybe you can talk a little bit about that. What are some ideas about how we can leverage the private sector, which is present in every environment, fragile or non-fragile, to support progress in this area. Tarek, over to you first.
Sure. So two examples of how we're beginning to think about this at Crisis Group. One work in progress and one more polished that you can find on our website. On the first, it's interesting to think increasingly about the private sector as a peace and security actor. And to Tara's point about granularity, not just think about granularity at a geographic level, but also think about granularity and heterogeneity within the private sector. So you take the natural resource wealth issue, which came out quite clearly from the clustering analysis. There's a large academic and policy literature discussing how natural resource wealth is associated not just with worse economic conditions, but also increased violence in settings with weak institutions. But that's a bit of a black box, if you will. We don't understand why some companies and some countries are able to navigate those risks successfully, and others are not. And if you look back, the African Development Bank did an analysis 4 or 5 years ago, just sort of benchmarking how much money is at stake for developing country governments in Africa, in particular on the continent. And they found that, roughly compared to, I think the figure was in 2014, $50 billion worth of ODA, official development assistance, public revenues from natural resource extraction were projected at about 30 billion. So serious amounts of money that are going to these core questions about poverty alleviation within these states. And so what we're doing is taking advantage of unique data sources and then complementing it with qualitative field work. So on the data side, we're taking geocoded ownership histories of which companies have been operating where, what activities were taking place, which minerals were mined, or if it was oil and gas, sort of what the magnitudes of those activities were, and then crossing that with georeference data about violence to understand is, in essence, how heterogeneity across companies helps you understand both which companies are more likely to operate in conflict-affected settings and what concerns that may rise from a regulatory perspective, but also conditional on being in a setting, how the behavior of a company, for example, its approach to securitization, is it in the branch of sort of, hard securitization, guards, gates, and guns, or does it find a soft approach to securitization where it partners with the community, where it engages, say in the mining context, artisanal miners and reduces the conflict risk between them? So this is all being complemented with deep qualitative field work, interviews at site locations to be able to unpack exactly some of these dynamics and to provide recommendations, not just to governments, not just to civil society, but also to the private sector itself to think about how to play a more responsible and enlightened role in these settings, so that those actors within this sort of heterogeneous mix of the extractive industry who do want to behave better have sort of a sense of what that would entail. Very briefly, a different type of example, which I consider sort of a more hopeful one, it comes from the Korean Peninsula, where we were able to publish last year a very interesting report on the Kaesong Industrial Complex, where we had access to microdata from firms that operate within that complex. For those who are unfamiliar, this is a complex where South Korean firms crossed the demilitarized zone in order to work with North Korean workers. And it gives you some picture of what an eventual reunification of the North and the South could look like from an economic perspective. It also helps you quantify what the peace dividend is in that context to give you more ammunition from a political point of view to appreciate sort of how much gains could exist for both countries from being able to overcome that, but also how those would be distributed across sectors. Because there was a misperception, I think, in the qualitative conversations that had taken place and the political conversations around Kaesong, that was a giveaway to a certain set of companies in the South. And in fact, there were a number of companies that saw significant increases in productivity, even given that they were paying above average wages to these North Korean workers and treating them quite well. So finding those sort of win-win propositions, analyzing them, and presenting them back to both political and private decision makers so they can understand what their role is in advancing both peace and inclusive growth.
Thank you for those two very interesting examples. And actually, in touching upon the role of the extractive industries, you also, in a way, answered a question that we had received from Gabriela Mundaka exactly on that issue, on the role of the sort of raw materials and extractive industry in fragile countries. So thanks. Asad, maybe let me turn to you for some complementary thoughts on the role of the private sector.
No, thanks. No, I think the role of the private sector is absolutely essential to if countries, FCB countries, need to have any prospect of growth. Tara was talking about the links between poverty and fragility, but one of the strong correlates of both is really joblessness and the high rates of unemployment, particularly among youth. That actually makes it very difficult for societies to come together. And that, of course, Tariq was talking about the extractives, and a lot of the challenges is really about the inequality or in the distribution of resources and access to opportunities, in access to even power and decision-making capabilities, and sometimes even in access to information about what is happening. That actually drives people to frustration and for societies to suffer from these problems. So rebuilding that private sector, sort of engine as the engine of growth and jobs is absolutely critical. And I think we have to find new opportunities also in many of these countries. We were talking earlier about Yemen. One of the things that we were, and this was still a country in conflict when I was working on Yemen, and there were large power blackouts. But then we could see that people who could afford to were able to import solar panels from neighboring countries and actually install them. But then public services were not, obviously, did not have the money to do that. So we financed a program that would help create a market that would, a local market that would, for the importation and for the maintenance, the installation and the maintenance of solar panels that would give power to hospitals, to schools, to health clinics. And that was a wonderful story that in the middle of a conflict that we could actually create, help private sector provide lighting and various services in partnership with the government. In Somalia, we have been thinking about how, working with the government, of how to reduce the transactions cost for entrepreneurs to actually set up companies and to do business. Because very often in many of these FCB countries, you have heavy regulations that actually throttle the energy of entrepreneurs who are already struggling to try to make ends, and they may not really have the resources and the wherewithal to engage into to undertake the heavy costs that are needed in order to establish a business. So how can we simplify licensing, registration, various other things that can make it easier for entrepreneurship to thrive and for entrepreneurs to create jobs at the micro level and the small level. There may be commodity chains, for instance, in Sudan, the grain importation, distribution, and marketing of grain is a very controlled chain. But by opening up that chain, bringing in private sector in, I think it can create jobs for people to actually do that. So there are many various opportunities that one has to look at on a country by country basis to see how distortions can be removed, how markets can be opened up, how greater transparency can be introduced, how programs to support financing for entrepreneurs, how platforms can be set up, maybe digital platforms to bring in young people, men, young boys and girls, men and women into the labor market, and to give them the opportunity to actually make a living and fulfill their potential. So it's all about opportunity at the end of it. And I think the more that we can help create an open and a level playing field for this opportunity, for access to opportunity, I think that is where the stimulus for the private sector can be provided. Thanks.
Thank you, Asad. We're going to change gears a little bit. And Abby, I'm going to come to you to touch again upon something that you mentioned earlier. So we have, for example, Luis Vieira and others pointing out that very frequently the source of fragility is it's very localized. It's really about what's happening in a local environment and the weakness of local institutions. And you had earlier alluded to the potential role that communities can play in that context. So we had a question from Isaka Saliu, who was asking, concretely, what is it that communities can do and how can we support them? so that they can be engines of change and engines for good. And you had talked earlier about accountability. So I would want you to elaborate a little bit more on that. If some of the sources of fragility are truly local, how do we leverage communities to overcome that?
Thanks, Karolina. It's a great question. And it really speaks to the complexity and the power dynamics at community level and national and global level. I'm glad that Assad also started to mention the issues of inequality that actually contribute and can perpetuate fragility and conflict. But at the local level, there are power dynamics. There's political economies at all levels, and understanding whose voices are being heard and why, and whose are continuously being disenfranchised or marginalized. Who are we not hearing and why? And often there's power relationships and dynamics at the very local level, of course. And I think it's fundamental of making sure we're bringing diverse voices to the table. We know that women's groups are often left out. Women's voices are often left out of the decision-making table, and women's rights groups themselves are extremely underfunded. I think less than 1% of global funding goes to women's rights organizations in particular. And if you look at some of certainly big decisions that have been made over decades in terms of looking at the role of women in peace and security and UN Resolution 1325, et cetera, that's something we really have to live up to, and we haven't. And until that happens, we're not going to be able to see the significant progress at local levels, at national level, and global levels. So some of these things that might sound like checklists, and they're obviously more complicated, but is that ongoing investment in local community-based organizations, those who are marginalized, investing in women's organizations, and ensuring that there's a power dynamic that is not just one-sided at the community level.
Thank you, Abby. Many in the audience were quite intrigued by the discussion that we had earlier on data and the importance of data, but also how can we advance this agenda in these environments. So I'm gonna come to Tarek, and then maybe Tara also ask you to reflect on this, because I know this is a point of discussion in the report. And this is a question from Blessings Bota, who's asking for any good practices that we have for what governments, in this case, should do in fragile and conflict environments to strengthen that very basic foundation of data. So Tarek, maybe you can connect these to the broader discussion we were having earlier. Over to you first.
Sure. Well, I think there's a long-standing tradition of support from the international community towards, and particularly from the bank as one of the primary players towards developing the capacity and expanding the coverage of central statistics offices, as I referred to earlier. I think one of the central challenges that those institutions face in conflict-affected settings is access to certain parts of the territory. It might not be safe to conduct surveys. There might be parts of the territory which are non-permissive. And that sort of creates precisely the type of biases that we worry about, and that Tara and her co-authors report grapple with quite seriously in terms of the lack in our knowledge might sort of lead us to underestimate the severity of the challenge in such settings. I think we're beginning to see strands of this in different countries at different times and in different ways of beginning to use innovative methods, starting with satellite data. Moving on to that, as I mentioned earlier, to large-scale digital trace data from mobile phones, for example. Even now in some countries in East Africa, particularly where adoption has been high, mobile finance, so mobile money systems also providing a new set of indicators. And in each of those settings, I think one of the challenges that we really need help from the international community, the World Bank and the UN in particular, I think is creating the frameworks to guide data privacy, but also the utilization of data. So being able to establish, as there's a bit of a Wild West experimentation on the use of these new methods, some exciting country-specific results. One of my co-authors having written on Rwanda, I having spent some time looking at these methods in Afghanistan, and a number of other countries are experimenting with them. We lack at this stage, I think, the full set of cooperative dynamics and the full set of platform-level support to be able to pursue those types of new indicators, to be able to create a digital commons in which data can be anonymized, but also shared across governments, civil society, and researchers in particular, and basically stress tested and examined. I think that is a huge area for improvement, and I think there's some interesting efforts to build upon there. I think more generally, we're finding there's this shift over time, and the digital economy represents this in so many ways, of going from seeing governments as the central holders of data to now governments as the central regulators of data, but the private sector often is the key producer of data. So adjusting our mental model to realize it's not just the Central Statistics Office going out and collecting data, but it's the CSO and the government above it thinking through what are the proper uses of data in this setting, what are the potential risks, but also what are the benefits? How do we balance those in a transparent way where individuals have, visibility into those decisions? And what more can we do to overcome some of these central questions that governments face about being able to really measure in their own backyards?
Thank you, Tarek. So Tara, let me ask you maybe to share, some of the thinking that you already put forward in the report in terms of, how can we start addressing some of these data gaps that the report has unearthed? But maybe this is also a good opportunity to share maybe one example of the innovative work that some of the teams are doing in trying, again, to overcome some of these difficulties that we encounter in fragile and conflict environments where we are trying to collect data about households and individuals.
Thank you, Carol. This data challenge, I think, as Tarek mentioned, I think the world is presenting opportunities where we are also understanding risks, right? With that broad statement. The bank, first of all, has been investing a lot in collecting data on, displaced population. There's a whole joint data center that is established in Copenhagen, and the bank is trying to work with UNHCR to see if we can, add the displaced population that rarely, are included in household surveys. And a lot of exciting work is going on. Now, there are many countries where the actual traditional infrastructure of collecting data is not present. Yemen, for example, right? We can't go door to door collecting surveys the way we traditionally do, collecting data the way. So we've actually, in that case, collaborated with WFP, and for the past 6 months, we've been, using other platforms which use mobile phones to actually collect and broaden the space of, headline indicators, things we should be caring about in Yemen, like food security, basic access to services. So we are kind of designing the modality of data collection as well as the content to make sure that the things that are very important to track, we're able to track at a very high frequency because things change very quickly, right? Similarly, we are also trying to invest in some ways to bridge the data gap coming through these sorts of surveys with this big data and social media, right? Tarek mentioned geo-reference satellite data, right? There's also the cellular trace data, CDR data, that is actually contributing a lot to creating poverty maps. There are analytic techniques that are being used and vetted with validation from real surveys. And I think these are becoming more and more important everywhere, but definitely in the context of fragile and conflict-affected countries. So the world is presenting us with lots of ways to use explosive, exponentially growing data. The flip side of it is there are regulatory stuff, right? Like privacy and other things that are going to come to play in being able to access this sort of information and also the accuracy with which we're able to track people who need these most, right? We use mobile phones. Are we leaving out people? left behind or most needy of support. So these are the things we're grappling with in terms of monitoring, but we have an array of work now initiated in the COVID pandemic context, where lots of ways in which we're trying to track and monitor and pulse of economies that are, where individuals and households are being, how they are being affected by the risk of this pandemic. And those approaches are things we've learned from the work we do in FCS context. So this is a reverse gain in a way, in the way to sort of collect data. So in sum, I think the innovations are still going on, and I think there'll be more and more ways we will discover. One of the opportunities that this crisis has also presented and triggered, so we're hoping to be better and more effective at these sorts of techniques and data collection strategies. Thank you.
Thank you, Tara. I think with that, we are actually going to bring this event to a close. I would like to thank Tara, our panelists, and of course, all of you who have been with us for the last hour and 15 minutes. I think we had a fantastic discussion. We touched upon very many issues. And, I want to attempt to summarize that, but I want to leave you maybe with a couple of takeaways, at least from my perspective. I think the event started with a very sobering picture of the challenges that we face in fragile and conflict environments when it comes to poverty, when it comes to inequality and the long-lasting effects of these. That bleak picture hasn't completely gone away, but I think we've heard some very interesting suggestions, ideas, and experiences from our panelists that point to the fact that things can be done, that progress can be made in fragile and conflict environments, that this is going to take a whole of society approach. So it's not just about the governments. We talked about how the private sector can help, how communities have a critical role to play. But again, there are concrete things that can be done. And I think in a way, behind all of those examples, there was this idea of, difficulty is the mother of ingenuity, right? So this innovation happening in these spaces, and what's critical is that we continue to generate the data and we continue to generate the evidence and the learning that allows us to know what works and what doesn't, why and when, so that we can go from one experience to the next and successfully apply that more broadly. But again, this is a beginning of a conversation. Let me remind you of the fact that we have a virtual series plan that will touch upon many of these issues in more detail over the next few weeks, and that we hope that this really whetted your appetite to come back and continuing to engage with us on this very important topic. So with that, let me again thank our panelists. If this was a live event, we would all clap together at this point. This is going to have to be a virtual clap, but please consider yourselves thanked from us, and thank you, and goodbye, everybody. Have a good rest of your day.